Okay, so while probably a few people will drop in following, let me just quickly take you through the agenda for today. So first of all, big and warm welcome to everyone who's joining. I'm getting, I'm saying it carefully. I'm getting over a cold. I'm not sure. That probably doesn't sound like it, but I'm trying to get over it. And then Sam, one of our panelists, has a sick son, and I now have one too. I think I infected him. So we're doing well on the health front, but thanks for joining the State of Hybrid Work in Singapore roundtable. So just for a quick introduction, the theme of today is discussion and value. So we really want everyone who is joining today to walk away with something, a new connection, a new insight, a new tip that they can apply in their own workplace. We've tried to really curate the guest list and invite people in that actually are running workplaces and therefore can learn from the guests and learn from each other. So in terms of the agenda, right now we have the welcome everyone. So I already said welcome everyone. So welcome everyone. And then I'll just highlight a little bit of some of the research we've done recently about the state of hybrid, and then we'll quickly jump into the panel discussion. And then we will follow with the interactive roundtable where you get to jump in and talk to peers as well as the panelists. I think only Sam may have to jump out if the doctor schedule is on time, and he lives in Singapore, so you know the schedule may be on time. So that's what we're going to do today. So just by a quick introduction in terms of the research that we've been doing and the reason why we're here today. We have been circling around this article about McKinsey that said that 90% of companies will embrace hybrid work, which combines work from the office and work from home. I think this came out in May last year. And since then, obviously, a lot has changed because now companies are not just thinking about it, they're actually doing it, both in Singapore and abroad. And for good reasons, right? I think everyone who's involved in hybrid knows that, you know, when you switch to hybrid, you reduce your real estate costs, right? You need less office space. That also means less operating costs. You may be more attractive to talent to join the company, especially working parents and older employees. There may be higher level of job satisfaction. There's a piece of research from Mercer, work engagement, and also commitment to the organization if you do it well, which we will talk about later, how to do it well, and significantly improved employee retention. So if you've seen the research from Stanford, we'll circulate it after this. But they did a big study with C-Treep and saw that people who are in hybrid organizations or people who have more choice, they do stick around longer. And you know, probably, again, this is sort of like a small circle of people who are all sort of like going through the same thing at the same time, all trying to figure out this hybrid thing. It's not even that there are just benefits and therefore maybe we should do it. Usually there isn't really even a choice. In Singapore, the research showed that 60% of employees, they want to mix from remote and office work, or maybe even just work from home, almost 20%. Elsewhere in the region, the same thing. For example, in Vietnam, only 9% of people want to work in an office full time. And so there are a lot of reasons to do hybrid, but I think what we are all encountering now, and again, everyone here is involved in some kind of way, either as head of people or head of organization, to figure out hybrid for their company, that there are definitely some challenges as well. And that's really what we want to focus on today. So the 12 key challenges that we found out through the research, which will circulate after the roundtable, are really a big spectrum of issues. And I think most of you will probably be able to check off on you know, some of these issues. So for example, setting good hybrid guidelines, like even knowing what your hybrid workplace really looks like. There was some Microsoft research from earlier this year that showed that 28% of companies have set some kind of a hybrid guideline, which means that the other 72% hasn't done it yet, which also makes it very difficult for people to then adhere or engage with the hybrid guideline. Driving and training change is another big topic that we hear a lot. Getting people back into the office or getting people into the office for new joinees over the last 2 years is a big challenge. Designing and managing hybrid offices, fostering trust and communication, driving successful collaboration, onboarding new hires. I think we hear that a lot as a key challenge. Creating connections and community, cultivating the company culture, especially when you're more distributed, and then promoting DIY, or we should probably say BDI, ensuring mental and physical well-being, and then driving learning and development. And through all of that, obviously, technology. So these are some of the challenges that we have come across in our research. Again, this is a part of a white paper that we'll share out after the session, which includes all the research that we pulled together with some helpful tips. But I thought this would be a good point to kind of pause and actually ask you a couple of questions. So first of all, we're very interested if you're in one of those leadership roles. Are you adopting hybrid work? So I'm going to launch that poll right now, and you should be able to vote on that poll. Is it coming up? Do we see a poll on the screen, guys?
Not yet.
Okay. I've clicked launch, but for some reason it's not launching. Okay, let's try it again. Okay, no luck with the poll. Well, at least as Steve Jobs would say, then we know this is clearly a live session if the technology doesn't work with us. So we'll do a poll afterwards, or maybe in the discussion we can talk maybe more directly between each other. You know, what are some of those key challenges that you're running into, and just besides the research that we'll share, just to kind of introduce also why we're here and why we're excited to have this discussion. So Jonah, myself, and Greg, our co-founder in Amsterdam, have really been thinking a lot about this problem about when people can work from anywhere. When should they come to the office and why should they come to the office? So that's why we built this platform that you may have seen the name on the title slide, FlexOS, which is an operating system for companies to manage successful hybrid workplaces and hybrid workforces, so offices and teams, and really focus on all the key kind of challenges that companies typically run into in terms of managing people in space, engaging, retaining, rewarding employees, and then also becoming more data-driven. So, we have features like being able to see when your colleagues are going to be in the office, so you can plan your office days when people are actually there, so you don't end up sitting at your desk doing a Zoom meeting with yourself. Gamifying the attendance, so if you're adhering to your hybrid policy, you can win prizes, so you're somehow more motivated to join in. Events and activities, drawing people into the office. So we produce that on behalf of companies, letting people pick out the space that they want to work. And again, very much with that social component, making sure that you sit near the people that you want to work with, and then getting a lot of data and insight. So we'll share a bit more after the session. But again, the point of today really is to learn together, to support each other on this hybrid journey as practitioners. And so with that, my pleasure to introduce the three panelists. So we have Sam Neo from StoryBuddy. We have Susan from Riot Games. You can also ask her about her gaming handle, which will reveal you a lot about her. And then we have Renee from Goto. So let me stop sharing the screen and bring the panelist here on the screen. Great. And yeah, guys, so we had a couple of conversations before we went into this session, and there were so many insights. So I'm sure that there will be a lot to learn from you guys for everyone on the call here today. But maybe just to start with a quick introduction, and then also, is your company currently deploying hybrid, and what does that look like? Maybe like 1-2 minutes each. I'll start with Renee.
So what does hybrid look like for us? We're actually just kicking off the journey. So it's really good timing to be meeting with all of you and discussing it. We literally had our town halls and presented to our employee population. What we ended up doing is actually having, when we did a lot of our internal research and focus groups, that realized that we had 4 major archetypes. And so we decided to create 3 models for working and leveraging that based off of what type of work it is. And then with that, what is the needs of the employees and the needs of the leaders in the business. So the 3 models are mostly remote. And I would say mostly meaning not that you never come back to the office, but that you are mostly remote, but there would be times when you would still potentially come back, things like offsites, major planning, yearly events, things like that. And then hybrid, as we're talking about today, with a minimum of 4 days a month, but within that, there could be some, or would be some flexibility based off of the team and the leadership and also the person's needs. And then the final type, though the smallest type, is fully on-site, because there are a small group of jobs that really need to be done 100% on-site and every day. For example, handling data servers or workplace management itself. So really, first of all, grounding on the work itself, and then understanding what are the business needs, the leaders' needs, and what are the employees' needs, and being able to have those options and be able to have that conversation. So that's what we're doing at Goto Financial.
Beautiful. And you're doing that across a couple of markets, right, Renee?
Yes, so we're an Indonesian company, but we actually have employee bases in groups in Indonesia, Singapore, India, and Vietnam, with the largest obviously in Indonesia. Second largest is actually India, and then Singapore, and then followed by Vietnam. Okay,
so we'll definitely have to circle back and sort of see what are the cultural differences and how does, one policy apply to multiple countries. But before we do that, handing over to Susan to share a little bit about how you guys approach it at Riot.
Sure. Hi, everyone. I'm Susan from Riot Games, and I head up a people team for Asia. That's across 11 countries, across all our products. So that includes esports, publishing, and also game development. I actually really love what Renee shared. It feels very sort of structured, well thought through. We're probably a little bit more broad. So our approach has been more thinking about what is DNA of our company, right? So it's about innovation, it's about creation, it's about what we call be together to sort of make magic happen. So we do within our DNA believe there's absolute benefit for our teams to continue to find time to be together. So we're a bit more hybrid in the sense that we have a policy, what we call 1-3-1, which is what we're introducing, what we call core day rhythms, which is Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursdays are the days that you are expected to be on site across different functions, pillars, and then Monday to Friday is the remote work days. However, I think one of the challenge of when we talk about hybrid work, we almost make it completely disconnected to the world before COVID, right? Almost as if there's a world before COVID and there's a world after COVID. But in reality, before COVID, we were already flexible. If you have to travel, you have to be in a different country, you're working remotely for 2 months at a different office location because we're running a big tournament in a different country, that's how it happens. It's okay. So how we are working through is get people to think about the world now collides into a new world where previous world doesn't just stop existing, right? Like 1-3-1 is what we call our working rhythm, but some of us may come in still half a day. Some of our, rioters come at 10 a.m. because they prefer to work during the night, and that's okay. So I think it's a lot more about how do we continue to think about who we are as a company, how do we connect the DNA to the work we do, and everything else are just framework of allowing us to operate with that goal in mind. So we have that, but we keep reminding them, do what is right for you, for your team, and for the players with a clear expectation. We're not going full remote, but we're going to be super flexible because we're here to be closely connected to our players and our team.
I love a couple of beautiful concepts in there, which I'm sure we'll circle back on as well. So thanks for sharing, Susan. And then Sam, not only do you have your own company, you're also consulting for a lot of companies in Singapore when it comes to employee engagement and employer branding. How are you looking at this topic?
So I think from an employer branding perspective, I think we focus a lot on messaging. I think that's very important because often when it comes from HR perspective, we introduce a lot of great initiatives, but we don't communicate it clear enough, like how Susan and Renee has communicated so beautifully, right? So I think for me, when I look at the market and even internally when we do such thing, I think what we're trying to communicate for hybrid work in particular is about a couple of things, like choice. We talk about flexibility, we talk about trust, we talk about outcome focus rather than having the face time essentially, right? So that's the key thing that I think is quite important when we roll out these policies, when we roll out these initiatives in terms of hybrid working, because we don't assume that employees understand what we are thinking as leaders or policymakers or HR, right? I think that's often the misconception, and it's a pity, right? If we roll out something really good and employees don't see the full benefit or true intention behind, I think that's where the gap happens. So I think the first thing to consider really, right, is the messaging, and to make it as blatant as possible if you can, and constantly reinforcing the message at different touch points across the board, essentially. So for us, how do we execute the hybrid part? For context, because my team is generally below 30 on average, pretty young group, and not that huge, 10 plus of us at this moment. And in particular, for some of the clients I work with, the younger ones as well. We use a platform called Gather Town, which is like a virtual office. I think most of you are probably familiar by now, where people use it for virtual offices, for career-related events and stuff like that. It's great, right? Because in a way, even though we don't go off to office every single day, it's a hybrid model of sort. But people feel like there's some ownership, right? They have their own offices virtually. They can walk around, they can log in if they want to, then people can look for them quite quickly. I think that helps to some extent. It's like a bridge. Obviously, it's not a foolproof solution, but it's a bridge. So I think that's one part that's quite important for us. And the other part is then we have 2 fixed days that we go back to office. It's Wednesdays and Fridays. So I'm going back to office today in the afternoon. But what we say is that these are 2 days that you can go back to office, but it's not a must to go back to office. I think there's a slight difference over there, right? That, unlike some of the clients I work with, it's a mandate, like 135, you have to go back, and the rest is remote. And sometimes it cheeses people off a little bit, because ultimately one of the key things I mentioned is called choice and flexibility, right? But with choice and flexibility, and you're mandating that.
Cutting out at a very crucial part, but good, good time to wrap up that point. So Renee, Sam was sharing about how even if you can formulate based on your archetypes, for example, a very clear policy or a very clear guideline, then you still need to communicate it, right? So how did you go about, especially again, you're in different markets, you're dealing with different cultures, maybe different levels of reception, maybe even different age groups. How did you go about actually activating, that strategy once you had created it?
Yeah, I mean, it's a good question. I think it's really important that you don't just, how do I say this? I think employees are really keen to hear what's going to happen. We definitely were getting questions for quite a long time before we ever got to actually announcing, because there was actually a lot of anxiety in the system. What are you going to make us do? What are you going to make us do? And so we probably got that, as early as January, February this year. If anything, actually, even December last year, it ended up with Omicron that got kind of pushed out for a bit, but it starts pretty early. And so it was really important, one, that we needed to show to our organization that we had been very thoughtful in our approach. We had considered the employee's voice, not necessarily that we're going to be able to do everything that they want, but definitely that the consideration and that the listening had occurred. And what are the principles and the why, what I would say, of what we're doing. So we really tried to ground that, and as much as possible, really have the leaders lead that this isn't an HR thing. I think like most things, when it's an HR thing, it's kind of dead in the water. And so really making sure that the leaders voice why and have a clear articulation of why we're doing what we're doing. Flexibility and a certain amount of autonomy was definitely part of the values that we wanted to drive for, but also accountability. And that with a certain amount of freedom also means responsibility and accountability for making sure that the performance is met, that things get done, that you're creating the right relationships, and that you're having the right impact. And so those sorts of messages are really important. We started with basically a very large town hall for the entire company across all markets, all roles, all demographics. And then we started to cascade that down, because when you hear from basically the chairman or the CEO of the entire company, the first question is, yeah, but what about my team? What about my group? And making sure that those messages start to cascade down through the organization. And then again, that each level, as much as possible, those leaders are carrying that message, not just of the what, but again, like I said, the why. And I think the why was really important, because when you open up a model, similar like Susan said, whether you say 2 days a week, 3 days a week, 1 day a week, 2 hours a week, they're gonna go, why that? Why are you making me do that? You know, and if I can't do these 2 hours, can I do a different 2 hours? So they get really caught up into the mechanics, and we really grounded on, obviously on-site is a very specific thing. You need to basically be there, you know, every day. But all the other models, the focus was really on what kind of work that we want people to come back together for. So it was collaboration. It was brainstorming. There was a certain amount of being together, being able to whiteboard. Yes, you can whiteboard by virtual means, but there is limitations. You feel that by having people together and being able to do some kind of creation work. Community building. There are obviously technologies to do that, but still having that face-to-face with your manager potentially that you've never met because you were onboarded during COVID, or your team member that you've never really seen how tall or how short or what they really look like in person. You know, when the first time I went to Indonesia after like 9 months and met people in person, I had a lot of surprises. Oh, this is how you really look. You know, there is some need for that human interaction. And so we really tried to ground on, this isn't about attendance. This is about connection. And so when is connection important, and how do we use that as enabling? And when is actually downtime or focus time or all the other kinds of work across markets where, you know, yes, also human connection is important, but let's face it, we don't have endless budgets, so you can't show up in another country every week. And you also will have your own life needs, like Susan talked about, where you might have to pick up your child or take care of an ailing parent, or you might have a class that conflicts with that, right? And we also just heard from a lot of people that, for example, many of our markets, not necessarily Singapore, maybe is the one exception, but all of the other markets, that being stuck in traffic and having to think about long commutes was a real sort of dampening method, thing of, I don't know if I want to go back to the office and have to commute 2 or 3 hours total in my day. That's a lot of time.
Yeah.
As well as a lot of people, for example, in India or Indonesia, actually moved out of the major cities. One from a safety concern, and also from access to their family, from support systems. Do I have to move back? So a lot of those things are the things that we really think about when we're communicating that message and trying to get that down to people so that they can understand. I think overall it was relatively well received, at least it seems like at first flush. But there were certainly places and pockets where a certain amount of emotionalism or reaction, you could tell how much did they really hear of what we said kind of went through. You do have to think of it like prayer. It doesn't wear out with repetition, and how do you keep having the conversation and listening as well, not just telling people.
Yeah, so a couple of key insights. I think the one takeaway we all have is that once we all meet in person, we can be shocked by how tall or how short people are. That's a fascinating one. On Zoom, we all appear very equal. And yeah, definitely very interesting to hear about this idea of the why is just as important as the what. So we need to define very clearly, if there's one thing that people hate is, not being, in the know, like not being clear on what's actually expected of me. And there's also some kind of like notions of fairness there, right? Like if that applies to me, why doesn't it apply to someone else? And then the why becomes very important. And I think another theme I kind of like picked up here, which, you know, we talked about before the session, is really around how important managers become. You know, to a degree, there's this podcast interview between Adam Grant and Satya Nadella, the CEO of Microsoft, where he's talking about, you know, the line manager or the middle manager becomes more important than ever, because like in a distributed world, that's basically how you experience your company, right? Everything basically comes through that manager. And so they need to understand that why, and they need to understand, you know, exactly what is expected, and then being able to communicate that very clearly. But as I hear it often from clients and partners, that's very difficult when you're talking about, you know, young people in the region, 24, 25-year-old first-time manager, never really been taught how to be a good manager, and then suddenly are expected to be this amazing, empathetic coach that pulls people in and says, you know, let's stay connected, and hey, let's do something outside of just the work we have to do, and let's, you know, catch up over lunch after that status meeting, etc. So Susan, you know, question for you. How do you activate it into the organization, right? So there's sort of the setting of the policy, there's sort of like the communicating of the policy, and then there's the part of how do you make sure that it actually gets lived at each point of the organization, especially those managers who have to be those great role models.
Oh, it's a tough one, right? Because as much as we all talk about the guidance, the policy, it's really at the end of the day connecting to the why, right? I like what Renee says, being clear on what are the scenarios that people should be coming back in, but be really clear why these are the great opportunity to come in and use the time. Actually, I remember talking to someone who says beautifully that it used to be that your home is a place to play and you come to the office to work, but now it's almost the opposite. You work at home, but you come to office to play, in the sense that you want to work with your team. You say, we do collaboration work, we do whiteboarding, we do things that is actually less like your day-to-day when you're in the office. So I think is, how do we really reshift that mentality? And I think to Renee's point, that leadership, sort of that accountability becomes really important. And one thing I do continue to talk to our leaders about is also about consistency of our messaging. So actually, it doesn't matter, we have to keep repeating, as long as we repeat the same message, especially in large organization. You have pockets of leaders. How do we disagree but commit? You know, not everyone's going to agree with, you know, remote work, hybrid, all that. So, you know, to answer your question about how do we really live that message and be really mindful the time we spend together are really, really actually meaningful. So for example, for me, I have shifted all my teams one-on-one, like in person on site, to those core days, right? So it used to be on Monday. I used to do it on Monday, you know, it's beginning of the week. It's awesome. We get to talk. But now I'm like Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday is when we're typically on site. Then I spread out my one-on-one to make sure I have those one-on-one FaceTime. You know, that's when we have team lunches. This is when we do more extended planning time that is actually useful together. So I think for leaders, how do we role model and make sure that these times spent, people see that there's value to come in? Then that's how we start living that new world and that value.
Super interesting. Yeah, this idea of basically, you know, if you're going to come together in an office, or basically if you're going to come together anywhere, let's make sure that you don't sit again side by side logging into that same Zoom call or that same Teams call, you know, from your own laptop. And then, you know, as soon as that is over, like, you know, go off and do your own thing, making those moments extremely meaningful. And again, it almost like, it kind of reminds me of The Art of Gathering, the Priya Parker book, kind of one of our Bibles in what we focus on. You know, this idea of like, you need to be extremely intentional about how you design these moments, right? And making people, you know, especially those younger team members, feel excited to be a part of those days and use those days to build that sense of connection and community, which again, I think, you know, I always say the office was kind of a crutch, right? If you're sitting side by side 9 to 5, 5 days a week, or here in Vietnam, 6 days a week, you know, then sort of like that community, that connection, that kind of grows almost automatically, right? It's almost by default. Now you have to become much more, you know, intentional about how to actually make that work. And so again, it puts a lot of kind of stress and a lot of work onto the manager, right? Who then suddenly has to become almost like an amazing, you know, like tour leader. Here's the program for our next team day, from like 9 to 10, we're going to do a quick stand up. Then we have like 3 hours of collaboration, co-working session. Then we're going to do a team lunch, etc. So it sounds like, Susan, you've kind of embraced that. But then again, you're also very experienced, and you've worked in many markets, and you've been in this role for a while. How do we get again, like the younger managers to sort of do that as well, right? That's not going to be easy. So maybe question again for Renee, in terms of like activating it into the organization. What are some practical things that you're doing that work really well? And also, I mean, only if you feel comfortable to share, of course, it's early on a Wednesday morning, but maybe things you've tried that actually didn't work at all, so that people who are actually now for the first time launching a hybrid workplace can skip all those mistakes. I was thinking like 90% of our job is making mistakes and then somehow hopefully learning something from it.
Yeah, I mean, it's a great question. I think some of the mistakes are to come. So it's not that I'm not going to share. It's that I think that they will probably see how things work out. I think in terms of what works well and what doesn't is, I mean, you've kind of touched on it. Managers and leaders are really critical, but they're human beings. So they're at different places in their journey. And that's why ultimately HR in large part always has a job, right? It's our role to support and advise their growth and their learning. We're not just really an organization about policies and processes. So a big part of our role, I think, in this has been how do we be those advisors, and those coaches to managers and leaders during this time. And, in all transparency, I have some leaders or managers that really get it and they're nervous, but they're excited about this. And they realize that a lot of this change is just an evolution of what we've been doing through the pandemic and even before the pandemic, like Susan talked about, where it's not like we never had flexibility before. But we have other managers that maybe they've had a few bad experiences with a low performer on their team, or they feel that productivity has dropped. Their desire for control and how do we make sure that certain outcomes are done. And so their need for rules and policies to support that so that they don't have to think about that quite as much. Do sometimes, raise their heads in those spaces. And it's for us to be able to work with them to think about, how to articulate those needs maybe in a different way, and the reality is that flexible working and us thinking about the new ways of working is not actually a totally new concept. Like, we've been doing this through the pandemic. It was forced. Before the pandemic, a lot of organizations, this was actually on the conversation. It's just been exacerbated. And so we're at this new stage. And so them also continuing on their journey for that, to say, how are they willing to push the boundaries or think about that? How can HR support them to become more comfortable in these spaces? I think is part of another piece of what we're trying to do, to make sure that both the business needs are met, and also the employees' experiences are also being met, because they're very interconnected, right? And we know that as knowledge workers, that a lot of their discretionary effort is really what makes and breaks a business. So it's not a nice to have, it is integral. And there needs to be figuring out between us all how we make these things happen.
Yeah, beautiful. And maybe Sam, you can share a little bit about, when you hear some of these challenges, what would you typically advise companies to do, especially again on that communication front? Because it sounds like it's not just an issue about like one time communicating, but also then how do you keep it activated throughout?
Yeah, so I think a couple of things to consider, right? So I think like what Renee, Susan mentioned, the why is important. I think besides the why, right, it's also ensuring that we align it across the board, because like we discussed so far, right, that leaders play a very important role. And often we assume that just because they're leaders, they can do the job. And of course, the truth is far from that, right? So hence, I think the constant alignment is pretty important. I mean, you've seen a lot of examples where they say, okay, this is the policy. And then you ask them like, so what's the arrangement for the company? You say, oh, it depends on the leaders. Leaders can decide what they want. I think the great part about hybrid working is that, there's a lot of flexibility involved, but then how do we have a bit of structure within the flexibility to ensure the alignment? I think that's where the crux is to some extent. So how do we align the leaders to say that, okay, so this is the expectation so that they won't compare between the departments, for example, compare between colleagues, for example. And that, as small as it sounds, it creates a bit of rift, it creates a bit of bad taste in the mouth to some extent. That's one part, right? So number one is really alignment. Point number two is really what we call the moments that matter, right? So I think Renee briefly mentioned on that, and of course, Susan mentioned that briefly as well. It's about the experience creation. Often experience creation, we always think about the fun part, right? Employee engagement, the ping pong balls and stuff. But now with hybrid working, I think we probably need to take a step back, look at the finer details and the fundamental stuff, right? The moments that matter could be, for example, the day that they come back to office, the point where they reach the office. It could be, let's say, the meeting that's set up and stuff like that. What are the small moments that can trigger that positive and negative emotion? So just last year, we did an employer branding project for a pretty huge, Vietnam bank. And this was one key element that we focused on, because we realized that in a hybrid setup itself, right, all these touch points add up, as we all know, but it becomes even more important. It magnifies quite a fair bit, right, because of different alignment and stuff like that. So hence, it's important from an organization standpoint. How do we map out all these key moments that matter and kind of amplify in a positive manner, right, through this hybrid working, whether from home, in office? All this can make a lot of difference. So I think if I bring back to what I mentioned just now, the consistent messaging, the alignment with the leaders itself to ensure that everything's consistent, and building on the moments that matter, the small but important ones, I think these are important things that has shown in this hybrid working setup so far.
Yeah, and then probably we have to strike a very careful balance between consistency, but also being open enough to, as Susan and Renee both mentioned, to listen a lot and to adjust, as we go along, because it's sort of very agile in a way, right? It's like we can take our best hypothesis about what hybrid should be, but then maybe like 2 months later, we realize that was not the right way to do it. And then we kind of have to pivot a little bit again. So actually like being both consistent and also agile enough to adapt and to listen and optimize over time, that'll be very good too. So that was really, really helpful, I think, to kind of like level set us and kind of hear from the different panelists about how they're approaching hybrid work. And a big thank you to all of you for tuning in for that part. So we're going to move over to the roundtable discussion. We're going to split up in a couple of groups. There will be a moderator in each group to ask you a couple of questions to kind of guide along the conversation. And this will really be your chance. So everyone on the call that we've invited, this will really be your chance to talk to other peers in terms of, how are you doing it? What is working? What isn't working? And have an open discussion, because I think especially during the pandemic, we've been in too many one-way Zoom calls already, too many webinars already. So I thought let's just get the discussion going. And for everyone who we invited to tune in for the first part, a couple of partners for FlexOS, a couple of investors for FlexOS, thank you for joining. We'll say goodbye for now and then lead into the roundtable. And I think Mia will do the grouping. So very shortly, for that part of you who we invited for the roundtable part, you'll be assigned to a group, and then the conversation will continue there. And then we'll try and come back in about 35 minutes and share again between the groups what were some of the key insights, like what have we learned from each other, and how can we all learn even more as we go on this journey around hybrid work.
Okay, welcome back everyone. Give it back to you, Dan. Look like everyone got a really interesting story.
Definitely, yeah. So like I said in the beginning, like let's get people together, let's get people talking, and that's definitely what happens in our group. A lot of really interesting thoughts that were shared. For the purpose of time, I'll try to keep the recap really short. I think there was one point in particular that Antti made, CEO of SuperSun, that everyone kind of started nodding their heads very aggressively. I saw like very aggressive head nods, which was when he said that in this new world of working, productivity is up, but culture is down. And that led to a really interesting conversation around, how do you create and foster culture when you're not by default sitting together. And then a really interesting point from iSim from the Circles Live team, that it doesn't always have to come from the company. So her company, for example, just to get people excited to come back into the office, sponsored shuttle buses and organized like breakfast and lunches. But then the most interesting thing that happened was that when she was in a elevator, kind of spy on the wall, fly on the wall, overhearing a conversation of 7 people who are all going out for lunch, and they said, "Hey, we were never able to do this when we were in lockdown. So actually we should do more of this, and let's all do this again next Friday," right? So that when those kind of things get started, it doesn't just become a thing that the company has to do, but it really becomes a thing of the people. And once that happens, then maybe we work towards a very successful hybrid workplace, because it's not just us as company owners or as people leaders pushing initiative after initiative, but actually it starts to come bottoms up, which I thought was a really interesting kind of insight. And then Lan from MSD, also in Singapore, just joined the company and said that in his first month, Lynette also mentioned she was a COVID baby, joined the company during COVID. So in his first month, he only came in twice, and 2 times came into an office that was completely empty, kind of like a ghost town. And it felt like, coming in on a weekend day when you're doing some overtime work, and you're the only one in the office and you're sitting there all by yourself and you're like, why did I come here? And it seems like the experience was kind of like that. So also the discussion in the group was then around, again, how do you get people together? And how do you make sure that when people finally make that trip to the office, that they don't end up coming in on a day where there's no one there, or the people that they want to connect with aren't there, which is really interesting. So great conversation in the group. So big thank you to everyone who participated.
Okay, so I would love to hear more from Susan and Chuk group. So could you please have someone to talk more about it?
Please welcome Anyon.
Hello. What was that? My group? I'm not sure. Sure.
Do you want to kick off with some sharing from our team?
Okay, sure. Yeah. I wasn't quite sure if it was us or not. Long story short, I had the incredible privilege just to hang out with Dr. Susan Chen almost exclusively. So what we did learn as I'm both in gaming as she was, and then really dig into some insights as a technologist, was seeing, what has been unique in the gaming industry. There's really none, I think, for our digital first, digital native companies, where we're head all in the same direction, and that hybrid is almost like a requirement, a perk, and an increasingly sophisticated one to manage. That asked her a lot about technology and what is the hybrid work OS stack, and she said that it's super early days. We're still trying to figure out, trying to be a Slack first company that's super communicative, but not in the sense that we typically see on social media, where people have this big kumbaya town halls with a lot of faces, but everybody is checked out and too busy to join live. But actually there's things like other ways that are asynchronous that has been able to get people to be on the same page, like blogs and emails and a combination of multi channel communications is very important. And for a lot of organizations that are struggling with hybrid talent, even though we're giving all these flexibility where labor is short, especially in gaming and blockchain, the industries, we continue to go down the path that organizations need to groom and nurture their own talent and create pipelines for training and in-house upskilling. Anything to add, in Yao or Eileen?
Just a quick point that I shared, that while we talk about choices between remote and on-site, one of the things is that even when it's on-site or hybrid, that is still a case for choice where you can actually have flexi time, because the idea of hybrid, on-site or remote basically just talk about flexi place. But to make it more attractive for people to adopt any of this and come back, flexi time is one option. And I think someone was in Bangkok spoke about traffic jam. So staggered hours where you might work a little bit at home, that is another form of hybrid in the sense that you work like early mornings till about 10, and then you get changed and you come back during some off-peak hours for the train or the road. That will help. So let's not get, just be restricted by the fact that it's flexi place. There can also be flexi time. And the other thing that we do not consider is that there's something called flex style, where every individual has a preferred way of working. But just because someone functions very well on site or functions very well in hybrid doesn't mean that another person can do the same, because they do have different flex style personally.
Great insight.
Thanks,
Thank you
India.
for sharing. Yeah.
Can I just, I know we're on a schedule, but can I just say, Inyo, that's so interesting, because I think like a lot of the time we're just thinking about place, but it's also really about, the flexibility can go a lot of different ways, right? So on the 2x2, asynchronous versus synchronous, and then, together or alone, there's a lot of different ways to plot your dots, right, for your organization. So I think that's a really interesting perspective to think about. You can actually give people a lot of flexibility just by telling them, you're able to start an hour earlier or an hour later, and then that's okay, right? That's also that not other colleagues feel that's unfair. No, because it's part of the policy, it's part of the guidelines. So we all feel okay with the fact that's an option. Yeah, love that perspective. Thank you.
Okay, so let's move to step and even. I think you guys have a great story to tell. So just enter the breakout room. So can you share with other people?
Not sure it was that group, but I think so. Yes, I'll try to summarize and make sure that I respect everybody's contribution and it's aligned. So guys, if it's not completely accurate, please correct me. So a few points. First thing first, we said that when we can, and companies have the luxury of full flexibility, mandates and clear, strict instructions, like what have worked for Riot game, even if it's not strict, but giving a time frame for people to come back was a bit rejected on our side, because it was still a disguised type of instruction. So better was to be as flexible as possible and just offer guidelines and just show the way. So if you want to go, you can come that way. If you want to select this type of meeting or that type of meeting to be in the office because you think it's more productive, do it. But as much as possible, provide support and guidelines, less than something which can be understood and perceived as a mandate. The second thing we discussed was to have a very employee-centric approach, where you try to focus on their sense of accomplishments and fulfillment and what they want to get out of their job, and use the work from home and the work from the office as a tool. How do you improve their level of comfort, pride, satisfaction, mixing these places and those time slots where they can work. So we've seen a lot of great results when people can work late because they want to spend more time with their family, but so many examples. I didn't think about the example of a crowded city where you can commute out of the business peak hour, because in Singapore, you can go to the office anytime. There's no traffic jam. So that makes a lot of sense. Thank you for this example. The third thing was how to put a metric on whether or not your policies are efficient. And we thought, like, first of all, is the success of the company. So you want to make sure that you keep repeating the main goals and objectives of the company. So everybody having a very individual agenda in the work flexibility can still relate to what's the final objective and the goal of the company. And the main metric should be the success of the company. But of course, talent retention is the big one that everybody's considering right now, where there is a real junction of the way people work and the traditional way and the more progressive way. It's really crucial to see what makes people happy. So talent retention is one of the key metrics to measure the efficiency of those policies. Then we came with some interesting, just more anecdotic facts about how people have a lower level of tolerance because they've been working from home for the longest time with a lot of individual comfort. So how do we make them feel comfortable in a workspace and not downgrade their work experience? So that's about working on kind of collective intimacy and making sure that this manager will become so important. This middle manager can really give this feel of safety, trust within the team, but it's difficult, and trust was one of the key topics. How do you ensure that trust is given in a world where you don't see people so often? So trust is something you can't really fake, you have to build it. So that was one of the key challenge. And the last point, it was just about the younger generation. There is a stereotype saying that young people don't want to come to the office. I completely agree. That's not true. Actually, in a lot of organizations in our community, I can feel like the young people are the one pushing for it. And it's not because they don't have a home to work with from. It's just because they are craving for interactions and they want to build something, and they have a lot of energy and things to give. So a workplace is a good tool for them to express themselves. Guys, did I forget something?
Okay, so a lot of interesting findings. And by the way, like as a young people, we just don't want to go to the we just don't want to go to the office, but we just want to go to the office with the meaningful purpose, not just sit there and just like go into the Zoom link or like just yeah. So we just want to collaborate more with other people. So I know there's just a few minutes left, but I think like Sydney, there's one more group, and this group is really cool when everyone is just have a lot of things to say. So Sydney, can I have someone from your group?
So our group, because each of us are in different generations, so I asked about communications, how we utilize and make sure that to avoid misunderstanding when we work remotely or hybrid. So I think there are really cool insights from Lisa. Lisa, would you like to share something with us?
Yeah, other than the fact that I think Renee and I felt really old in that room. But I think a lot of it came down to really understanding and appreciating how different generations experience work, their access and their fluency with technology. But also I think, Enyur, you talked about flex styles. And I think the word that we may have glossed over is about inclusivity. Right. I think the inclusivity of different kind of societies, cultures, infrastructures, and personal situations as well, I think is really important. Renee had something really lovely when it's like thinking about hybrid work. It's about meaningful and intentional collaboration. It's not about attendance. And I think that's very important to kind of keep that top of mind. I think also, we talked about we did acknowledge the fact that obviously when you are working remotely, sometimes you lose some of that je ne sais quoi of sussing somebody out in person. They're short, they're tall, they're funny, they have a strange sense of humor or something like that, or you bond over a particular food or coffee, which might sometimes be a little bit difficult to address over video conference. It's not impossible, it's just a little bit more challenging. But I think Rachel had this really lovely anecdote. She's like, I'm an introvert, I love working remotely, kind of thing. If I don't have to interact with somebody, great. And I think it comes back to that inclusivity, which then kind of we need to think about that kind of DEI aspect about hybrid work. And I think a lot of it comes down to culture. And we were talking about this, about how culture, I see it as really what is that shared set of behaviors that actually informs and drives the things that we do and the decisions that we make. So I think culture is a lot bigger than just kind of meeting for coffee and having lunch. It's everything that is super intentional. So that we could go on forever and a day, but I'm going to wrap it up there.
Yeah, the beauty is obviously that all those things, Lisa, and that you mentioned about culture, they both grow and sustain themselves very well when you're physically together, when you're together all the time. And probably Steph will know this more than anyone, since she's the remote expert. It's like when you look at like big remote organizations, they basically say it's all about radical intentionality. You have to actually script out each one of these elements of how you create culture and then how you sustain it. You cannot leave anything to chance or anything to, oh, that will work itself out because people will see each other, you know, at this and this day and this physical location, whether it's an office or not. So that idea of the intentionality and starting to think again, really, like Yvonne said, you know, employee centric, thinking really about that person and how will they engage with the organization and how will they get to meet people. And like what Lynette said, I'm a COVID baby, you know, onboarded during COVID. Like, what does that look like, right? If you know, now we go more towards like a sort of like a medium between the two, how do we make sure that that all works out? So yeah, I mean, just the richness of insights. Thanks everyone so much for sharing. We're at the end of our time today. You know, just to me, really, really meaningful. Again, there's always so much in terms of theory and research, and you know, like ISIM said this when they rolled out hybrid. You know, they substantiated the why with like a lot of like, oh, here's the Microsoft research, and here's the Mercer, and here's the McKinsey. But at the end of the day, you know, we're still talking about people, and you know, the theory only goes so far. So it was really interesting to hear a lot of the practical insights, like how are you actually doing it? What issues are you running into? And as we said really early on, right, this is a learning journey. Everyone is at different stages of doing this. There will be a lot that we'll learn even just in the next 3 months. So I'll make sure to just share everyone's LinkedIn so everyone can connect with each other if you want to network further. And maybe we revisit this conversation in a couple of months and sort of see where everyone stands and what we've learned along the way. So huge thank you to Mia for organizing. Huge thank you to Sam, who was our partner in Singapore. Thank you to Susan and Renee, especially for your amazing sharing and for taking the time. I mean, we felt so blessed and grateful to have people of your stature to join. And thank you to everyone who joined in today. And thank you so much for the lively discussion. And hopefully until another time soon, hopefully in person, but let's see. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you. Take care.
Thank
you.
Very nice seeing everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. Goodbye, everyone.